I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Associate Professor Marta Garrido leads the Cognitive Neuroscience and Computational Psychiatry Laboratory and is the director of the Cognitive Neuroscience Hub at the University of Melbourne of Psychological Sciences. Marta is also a research program lead at the Grimke Institute for Biomedical Engineering at the University of Melbourne. Marta initially trained in engineering physics at the University of Lisbon and then did a PhD in neuroscience at University College London. Marta has held several research-focused positions, including University California, Los Angeles, UCL, the University of Queensland, before landing at the University of Melbourne. Marta's team use a combination of brain imaging techniques and computational modeling to understand how the brains of typical individuals and people with psychiatric conditions learn from experience and make decisions. And her research has been continuously funded with prestigious fellowships and research grants, with close to a 23 million awarded to date. Please give a warm welcome to Marta Garrido.
Can you hear me okay? Yes, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, especially Andy, who invited me, and thanks for coming. So I thought today I will not talk much about the brain, which is unusual. So I only have one slide with brains, and instead I will focus more on the sort of computational models that we've been fitting in with our behavior data to test different Bayesian accounts that explain certain alterations in autism and schizophrenia. First of all, it's not moving. The slide is not moving. It was a minute ago. Oh, maybe the mouse. Oh, there we go. So I'll use the mouse. Okay, so this is a very well-known illusion. So how many of you can see the white triangle? Well, in fact, there's no triangle there at all, right? So we are forming the triangle in our minds, but what is actually there are lines and these Pac-Man-like figures. And that is the actual sensory input, but somehow our brain recreates this image as having a white triangle there with some other objects occluded. Just getting used to this mouse thing. Okay, so I think this is so-called the Canizio illusion, and there's many other examples that show us that perception is different to sensation. That perception is related to sensation, but there's something else that is on top of that sensation that creates our perception. And what is that? So some people will argue is our prior knowledge. We expect to see triangles are very ubiquitous objects in the environment, so we expect to see these sorts of images, and we can use this prior knowledge to fill in gaps in the sensory information. So this, just ignore that red thing for a moment. What I wanted to say is that this sort of ideas have been formalized in the Bayesian brain hypothesis, which says that our perception of the environment is a combination between sensation or the likelihood information that we extract from ambiguous sensory information and prior information that we carry as our memories, prior experiences, and so forth. So when we look at this this image, most of us see have this illusion, but it turns out that autistic individuals are less prone to this illusion. The question is why? Why are autistic individuals seeing more as reality actually is? And there's been different accounts to explain this phenomena. And one is that perhaps autistic individuals have weaker priors. And so they favor the sensory information more so. Another possibility that would lead to the exact same phenomena would be that autistic individuals have stronger sensory encoding, and nothing wrong with the priors, just more precise sensory information. And again, this will lead to an over-reliance on sensory information. So to put a Bayesian picture into it, so if we could describe quantitatively priors and sensory information with Gaussians, this is what typical learning would look like. We would have prior, we would have a likelihood information extracted from the senses, and at the end of the day, we would multiply these two Gaussians and we would have the posterior. And what the Bayesian brain hypothesis says is that our percepts are actually the posterior. So they're not a veridical representation of the environment, in the sense that they're not the same as the likelihood representations, and they're not the same as our beliefs or our priors, but there's something somewhere in between. And the posterior shifts to the source of information that is more reliable. So say when the sensory information is very reliable, then it makes sense to put more weight on the sensory information. But if you are, we were talking before in a dark room, we were talking with Charles about that, then it makes more sense to downweight the sensory information and rely more on prior knowledge. So what does that have to do with the Canizet illusion and autism? So there's been basically two camps proposing different Bayesian accounts for autistic perception. And the first one, which the authors described as hyperpriors model, says that what happens in autistic individuals is that their priors are blurrier. So their memories, their beliefs about the sensory environment are not as accurate as in typical individuals. And so when we integrate the prior and the likelihood, as we know, the posterior shifts towards the source of information that is relatively more reliable, and so it will shift towards the sensory information. The other account proposed by Brock says that actually there's nothing wrong with the priors. The priors are just as precise as in typical individuals, but what is happening is that the sensory representations are more precise. And you see what the problem is that at the phenomenological level, the result is exactly the same, more of a reliance on sensory information. So how can we go about disentangling these two accounts? And that is what we decided to do empirically. Sorry, this was just explaining the conundrum that we have exactly the same phenomena, but with very different causes. So what we were interested in is to determine what exactly is causing this phenomenon. So here's just summarizing the different predictions for the different models. So they both suggest that autistic individuals rely more on sensory than prior information. But the hyperpriors model says that autistic individuals have less precise priors than typical individuals, whereas the precise likelihood model says that autistic individuals have more precise encoding of sensory information. So we decided to empirically test these ideas, and this was work led by my former PhD student, Roshini Randania, who's now working as a researcher at Emotive. So we used a task developed by Villares and Cording a while ago, And the task, in the task, people are told that there is somebody throwing a coin at the pond, and they're aiming at the center. And then what they see is first the thrower, and then they see the splashes that the coin makes. So the splashes that the coin makes are these light blue dots, and this represents the likelihood information. So they only have partial information about where the coin might have fallen, and that and their task is to say where the coin has fallen. And so they have to move this blue bar to make that guess. Okay, so you see in this trial, the participant is moving the bar where they think it fell, and then the true position of the coin is shown. So where the coin had truly fallen. So what the participants don't know is that we are manipulating prior and likelihood and certainty, such that we have a 2x2 factorial design with narrow and wide prior and narrow and wide likelihood. So you can see here for the narrow likelihood, what happens is that the dispersion of the dots is very, very small. So it is a lot more precise, whereas in the wide likelihood, the dots are more far away. So there's more uncertainty. It's harder to determine exactly where the middle of those dots is. And so that's how likelihood variance is manipulated. Now, in terms of the prior, the way we manipulate it is that sometimes the prior is very, the thrower is very good, and so it throws the coin consistently around the middle. So remember, the prior mean is the middle of the screen. And so in some blocks, the thrower or the true position of the coin hovers around the middle, and people can see that because every trial they get the true position of the coin. So they learn that over the course of the block. And then when we change the thrower to one who's not so good, then the true position of the coin is actually more all over the place. Okay, so that's how prior and certainty is manipulated. Is that clear? Cool. So what do we expect here? So when we plot the position estimated by the participant, so that's on the y-axis, versus the true position of the coin. If people were only relying on sensory information, what we would see would be responses overlapping with the diagonal line. Okay, so that's when the centroid position would be always the same as people's responses. In fact, that's not what happens, as we predicted, because people are integrating the prior information as well. And so if people integrate the prior information, then this regression line will be somewhere in between 0 and 1. So if people were completely ignoring the sensory information displayed, they would always say, well, the thrower was aiming at the center, so it's probably at the center. You would see the people's responses hovering around the flat line. So now the other thing that you can see here is that the more unreliable the prior is, the more people rely on the likelihood. So if we compare, for example, these two, so in this situation, people are putting more reliance on the likelihood because the likelihood is narrow. But in this situation where we've got a wide likelihood, then there is a shift towards the prior. So people behave, generally speaking, in a Bayesian-like manner, in the sense that they weight prior and likelihood by how reliable these sources of information are. I won't show today, but we have lots of data showing that people are not actually optimal, they are suboptimal, and there's that will be another talk to determine why that's the case. But they are suboptimal, but they are Bayesian-like. So this data is actually from the Villaris study, but we replicate that in our study as well. So I just want to show the different measures that we use to test the hypothesis predicted by the two different models. So here we've got the regression that we fit to the data, and this I'm not going to demonstrate, but this can be demonstrated that the slope of this regression is dependent on the prior and likelihood variance. And then if we rearrange that equation, we can determine the subjective prior variance. So of course, we've got a prior variance by design, but if we define the subjective prior variance as a function of the slope that we have for each individual subject, then we can tap into the subjective prior variance. And then we've got a measure for the likelihood variance, which is a proxy. This is a very hard measure to get at, and so what we propose is the average variability that people have on every given trial. So what did we find? So these are the slopes. Sometimes I call them slopes, sometimes I call them sensory weights. My apologies, but it's basically the same. So how much are people weighting sensory information versus prior? And again, if it's close to 1, means that they're placing they're placing more weight on the sensory information, whereas slope of 0 would mean, or sensory weight of 0 would mean all evidence on the prior. So if you remember, both accounts predicted that there will be a difference between these sensory weights or slopes, and that the autistic group would have a greater weight, because they were the prediction is that autistic individuals over rely on sensory information, but that did not happen. So in a sense, we sort of rejected both ideas. There could be many reasons why that's the case. The sample is quite small, so it is possible that we just not picking up an effect that is there. However, we pressed on, and we tried to see whether, nevertheless, whether there were differences in the other measurements that we were interested in, namely prior variance, subjective prior variance, and subjective likelihood variance. So in terms of the prior variance, what we saw, so here on the y-axis we've got prior variance, and on the x-axis we've got the 4 different conditions. So N stands for narrow prior, narrow likelihood, narrow prior, wide likelihood, wide prior, narrow likelihood, and wide prior, wide likelihood. We didn't see any difference in the prior variance, so that rules out or that rejects the hypothesis that there is that the priors are blurrier. So we sort of refute the hyperpriors hypothesis. What happened to the likelihood variance? So we didn't find a difference between the two groups, but when we put everyone on the same scale of autistic quotient, we see a relationship whereby the higher the AQ score, the more precise people were. So the variance is going down. In other words, precision is going up. So this provides some evidence in support of the more precise likelihood model. So this is kind of puzzling because we didn't see a difference in the sensory weight, but we do see a difference in the subjective likelihood variance. The other thing that was interesting was that I forgot to say that we ran the main task with manipulating prior and likelihood variance orthogonally, and then afterwards we got rid of the prior and ran the task again with just wide and narrow likelihood. But of course, we thought, okay, this will be the no prior task. But of course, what we then saw, what I think we're seeing here anyway, is that people are actually carrying over the prior from task 1 to task 2. And they're doing so differently between the two populations. So in orange, you see the neurotypical individuals, and in green, you see the autistic spectrum individuals. And so the sensory weight for the autistic spectrum is smaller, significantly smaller compared to the neurotypical, which suggests that they're actually relying less on the sensory information than neurotypicals, which is actually the opposite of what we would have predicted. But what it seems to be is that they're actually carrying over that information into the second task. And so what we see is actually not that the priors are blurrier, but perhaps even more precise when in the second task. So maybe more precise is not the right word. They're less flexible. So they're sticking to the priors from the previous task, even though that is of no help in the second task. So it sort of speaks to perhaps a rigidity of behavior. So this was not predicted by either of those models. So I think we need to revise the model a little bit because we do not see this. We do not see a shift towards the sensory information. In fact, we see that if anything is shifting more towards the prior. The other thing that we see is that the likelihood, the encoding of likelihood information was more precise for people who had who were higher on AQ traits. So I think what we see in our data is something more like this model, like the Brock model, but possibly with priors that are more rigid, that do not flexibly change a bit between different tasks. Okay, so this is the brain slide that I said it's just going to be one. So the other thing that we did was we first did this task outside the scanner, just looked at the behavior, and then we think, okay, well, what is going on in the brain when people are doing these tasks? Because as you might have heard, the predictive coding framework suggests that the way in which the brain implements Bayesian inference is by communicating between different brain regions that carry for bottom-up information as inputs from the environment, and that is combined with prior information, which is conveyed through top-down connections from higher level areas in the brain to lower sensory areas. So we were trying to actually find correlates of these the variability in prior variance with the connectivity, and that's not what we found. But when we contrasted activity for the general task between autistic spectrum individuals and neurotypicals, what we found was that generally speaking, there was greater bottom-up connectivity for autistic individuals. So this links to the idea of sensory overload, as there's a lot more information going up that is not modulated by top-down control. So now I want to change gears a little bit to talk about schizophrenia, but you'll see the connection through this illusion. So just like autistic individuals, people with schizophrenia are less prone to illusions. So you can see, all of you can see this face as it rotates. It seems like it's hollow, but then you can't help but see it as a normal face, right? So this is called the hollow mask illusion. You can actually see one of these examples at the NGV. I'm not sure if it was a permanent or a temporary collection, but it is quite striking. Anyway, so people with schizophrenia are not fooled by this illusion, so they can see the nose pointing inwards, and so the question is why, and you could put forward the same sorts of ideas. Perhaps people with schizophrenia have more blurrier priors, and so they see the information from the environment more as it is, rely more on the sensory information. Or it could be that maybe the sensory information is more precisely encoded, and so again would lead to the same result of relying more on sensory information. There is also actually another set of experimental evidence that suggests that people with schizophrenia actually have stronger priors, which leads to things like delusions. But I will not talk about that today. So can we test this? Can we use the same machinery to try to quantify how people rely on sensory versus prior information, and also how much variance there is in encoding of these sorts of information in people with schizophrenia? Now, it's very hard to acquire data from people with schizophrenia. We've done it before, but it's a lot easier, especially during pandemics and whatnot, to do it in the general population and look for a continuum. So we were inspired by ideas of Van Os and others who say that psychotic-like experiences or psychotic traits live on a continuum. So everybody in the general population is somewhere on this distribution. But there's just that after a certain threshold, whether there's continuity or discontinuity, that is a matter of debate. But after a certain threshold, then there is a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So what we tried to do was to sample from the general population, and of course, very far away from that threshold. And we tried and we did exactly the same thing. We used the same task, try to quantify all of these parameters to determine what is going on in terms of sensory reliance on sensory information versus prior, and what's going on in terms of the variance of representation of these informations. So this is work led by a PhD student in my lab, Isabella Goodwin, who's in her second year. And also a former honor student, Josh Kugel. And what we have here is people doing exactly the same task as I described before, the coin task, in two different samples. We had a discovery data set and a validation data set. I became a great fan of doing internal replication. And so the discovery data set, we have 363 people, and then in the validation data set, we have a greater sample. So these are recruited from the just online through, I think the first one was Gumtree, and the second study was through Prolific. So, and these are the distributions of the psychotic-like experiences using a CAPE questionnaire. This is a community assessment of psychic experiences. And through that questionnaire, there's several items, and you can look at the negative experiences or psychotic-like experience, and then you can look at the positive as well, which is what we were more interested in, because that speaks more to the really characteristic things that we think about when we think about psychosis, like delusions and hallucinations. Of course, these people did not necessarily have a diagnosis, but there are certain questions that tap into those sorts of things. So the more you know, there's questions that are very you know, there's something like, oh, do you ever feel like people are looking at you? Well, I do feel that sometimes right now. But to things like, do you believe you have bugs under your skin? So, you know, kind of has the whole spectrum of psychotic-like experiences in the whole range. So, what have we done with these? So we've got the psychotic-like experiences on the y-axis. I will always present the discovery data set in green on the left and the validation data set in orange on the right. So we've got the psychotic-like experiences on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, we now have the global sensory weight. So there wasn't much of a difference that was relevant within conditions. So I'm collapsing all of these into a global sensory weight. And what we see is a relationship with the sensory weight being greater as psychotic-like experiences increase. And that's for both samples. The effect is very small, but the sample is big. So it is there. So if you remember, the closest to 1 means greater reliance on likelihood information. So what this is saying is that people are actually, as psychotic-like experiences increase, people are actually relying more on sensory information than prior. Then we looked at the prior variance, so the subjective prior variance. For each individual, and again the same thing, discovery and validation data set, and looking at relationships with psychotic-like experiences on the positive subscale. What we see is that the subjective prior variance increases as psychotic traits increase. So actually priors get blurrier as psychotic-like traits increase. Now, what happens to the likelihood information? So that the variance for likelihood information also increases in not on the discovery set. It wasn't significant, but it was significant on the validation data set. So it seems to be that actually both prior and likelihood variance increase as psychotic-like traits increase as well. I'll just put a parenthesis to say that Isabella has since run a temporal stability study to see how these parameters, how stable these parameters are across session. So doing an experiment in time point 1 and then doing exactly the same thing after a week or two. How stable are these measures? And actually this measure of likelihood is not it's only moderately stable, whereas the prior variance and the sensory weight is very stable, which is promising if you think about it. Could we ever use these in the clinic with some application? So I think what our data is telling us about what might be going on in people's brains is that at least for this task, as psychotic traits increase, the posterior shifts towards the likelihood. And even though there is a decrease in precision in both, there is the degree to which precision decreases for prior is greater. And so overall, people will still rely more on sensory information, even though the sensory information is also less precise than for people who are very much on the other side of the spectrum of, very few psychotic-like experiences. So, I want to wrap up now. So I've told you that both autistic individuals and people with schizophrenia are less prone to illusions. They sort of see things more as they are, at least for these sorts of perceptual experiences. But it might be because of different reasons, and we would not be able to know that unless we used these sorts of modeling techniques to really determine or quantify priors and encoding of sensory information. But what I want to say is that it might be differently. The reason why is the reasons for this over-reliance on sensory information are different for the different groups. So sensory representations are more precise as autistic traits increase, but less precise as psychotic-like experiences increase. Prior precision remains intact in autism, but gets blurry as psychotic-like experiences increase. But in some ways, we have more questions than answers, because, of course, as you would have picked up during the talk, there's a number of things that we could have done better. So the autistic sample is quite small, so it would be great to have a much bigger sample, and it would be great to actually try to replicate these findings, and also change around the likelihood only task to be in the beginning, so there will be no chance of carrying over priors. And then the other thing that would be nice to do would be to actually quantify the degree of transfer, because the data that I show you sort of indicated that perhaps there's less flexibility in transferring prior knowledge to a different situation. But at the time, we didn't really have a way of quantifying that transfer measure. But Sophie Lin, postdoc in my lab, has since developed a very clever way of quantifying knowledge transfer. And hopefully in the future, we'll be able to do a bit more on that. Then the other thing now, specifically around the study with psychotic-like traits, of course, that's a non-clinical sample, and we are assuming that we all live on a continuum of psychosis. But the question is out there whether it would really transfer into the clinical sample. So, would people with schizophrenia replicate these findings, or would we replicate these findings with data from people with schizophrenia? The other question that I have is whether there really is a continuity, or whether there's some discontinuity that discriminates those who seek help versus those who sort of are on the spectrum, but not really help seeking. Now, the other thing is how to reconcile these ideas, or the evidence that we have from our data and modeling, with the evidence from the overly strong priors. And there is quite a lot of evidence to suggest that that's the case in people with schizophrenia, delusions being one very obvious example. But there's been a recent study looking at people who hear voices versus those who don't, and they basically conditioned people to hear a sound, and they saw that people who hear voices were more prone to hear a sound even when there was no sound there. And then they did some complex modeling to show that that had to do with more precise priors. So how do I reconcile and harmonize these data? I really don't know. So the question is still out there. And then the other thing is, of course, I used the illusions as a phenomena to kind of motivate and excite you a little bit, hopefully wake you up. But in fact, we didn't really test illusions, right? We tested a perceptual decision-making task, not illusions at all. So whether we are really explaining illusions with whether what we find in this task of inference really transfers into what happens in illusions, we don't really know. Is it task specific? Could it be that for certain tasks the priors are blurrier, but for other tasks the priors are stronger within the same condition? That is a possibility. So lots of questions still to go after. So I just want to thank my team, and especially Roshini Randania, who ran all the experiments with autistic individuals, and Isabella Goodwin, who did the experiments related to psychotic-like experiences. Thank you.
Thanks, Marta. That was really interesting. I guess, so the question I have relates to your finding about people who adjust who have more, pay attention more to sensory information or the likelihood compared to the prior, right? And I guess the question pertains to the fact that doing this isn't any particular trivial thing, because I guess some of the criticisms of the Bayesian brain hypothesis, which I know that predictive coding and other mechanisms seek to address, is that calculating the likelihood of something is extremely computationally intensive, right? So it's not a particularly computationally tractable to be able to do that effectively. So anyone who is sort of then adjusting even more information to the sensory evidence, that's quite an interesting finding. So I was wondering if you had any kind of future ideas about how you could look at the nature of this sort of increased sensory encoding, right? Because I know that there's probably a lot of people in this hub that look at models and that kind of can disentangle that a little bit more. Specifically, like, you know, you can look at the quality of evidence accumulation that's being driven, or things like, you know, parallel or serial processing. So I was curious as to whether you thought about that more, about how that sort of shift could actually be occurring.
Yeah, actually, you say something interesting, that it could it be that the likelihood information is more uncertain because of because people with the condition will have a higher difficulty in computing. It's possible, though for autistic individuals is the opposite. But in terms of the other ways of measuring likelihood, I think we should really think about other ways, and I'd love to hear from people from the hub about how to, because as I said in Isabella's second study looking at temporal stability, the estimation for likelihood and certainty is not very stable across sessions, which seems to indicate that perhaps it's not a very good proxy for how people are encoding likelihood variance.
Sorry, we've got one question from Andy online and one question from Philip. Andy, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Marta. Yeah, that was a super interesting talk. I had a question about the autism end of things. So within the autism community, I think there's the saying something like, if you know one autistic person, you've seen one autistic person, which is to say that there's a lot of heterogeneity even within the diagnosis and the spectrum, and then especially when you're considering people who haven't, you know, are just on the spectrum. And so where I'm going with this is, my understanding is that there are some people with autism who have sensory hyposensitivity and some with hypersensitivity. And I was wondering if you looked at sort of subtypes of that, either based on the answers on the ASQ, or like, I guess I'm wondering if I mean, my prediction would be from your talk is that it's the people with the sensory hypersensitivity, particularly in the sort of visual type task as yours, that you'd expect to have this more precise likelihood, but not necessarily others. And I'd understand if your sample isn't large enough. So I guess this is also partly, has anyone looked at that? And or that might be a way to get more power out of a sample if you particularly screen for people who report that kind of hypersensitivity.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So with this, I don't know where to stand, because either I look at you and you don't look at me, or
Yeah, it's okay. I can see you. It's fine. You can talk to talk to the audience.
Okay.
Yeah.
So with the study that I showed you, we didn't see a relationship with sensitivity. And actually, I can't remember whether at the time, because that was the first experiment we ran, I can't remember whether we had a sensory sensitivity test. We had in the EEG experiment, which I didn't show you, but with this experiment, the subscale that correlated mostly with likelihood variance was attention to detail. So not really related to sensory sensitivities, but the EEG experiment that we ran, it wasn't this task at all. It was an oddball experiment where we had predictable sounds that repeated, and then deviant sounds. And when we subtract the response to the surprising events with the standard events, we have something called the mismatch negativity or prediction error response, and then we can correlate that with sensory sensitivities. And we saw that the people who were high who were hypersensitive also had a greater prediction error response. So it doesn't really answer your question, because we just don't have the data for the behavioral data, but it's getting there. Yeah. So I think I think what we have to do is repeat the experiment and add this other questionnaire to answer your question.
Cool. Thank you. Very cool work.
Thank you, Andy.
Philip, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Is my audio okay, Marta?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the really interesting talk. I want to ask you about suboptimality, which you mentioned is something you find. To me, the fact that people are sensitive to sensory information and sensory to priors doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing the task in a formally Bayesian way. We know that simple strength often is a good proxy for likelihood, and simple computations like normalization give you marginalization of the kind presumed in Bayesian integration. So my question is really, why doesn't suboptimality falsify the theory, falsify the Bayesian brain theory?
Yes, so that's a really, really good question. And we almost have a preprint I will send you in about a couple of weeks, where Sophie Lin in my lab, she created this mathematical formulation to quantify transfer. And it's exactly with this task, with the coin task, in healthy individuals. So I can't really say anything about autism or schizophrenia, but I think your question is in general, can people be suboptimal and still be Bayesian? So one of the key ways of determining whether people are Bayesian is whether they transfer knowledge from one situation, one task to another, in the form of a prior, right? So that's kind of the ultimate way of determining whether somebody is Bayesian, is whether they carry over a prior. And so, as I was saying, Sophie found in this in healthy individuals that even though they were suboptimal, they did transfer knowledge to a different task. And that was like clearly significantly above zero. So So I think we have empirical evidence to show that people can be suboptimal and still be Bayesian-like, whether they are exact Bayesian or whether they are doing some sort of approximation. That's another question. But why is it that people are suboptimal? I guess it could be that the algorithm is so hard to solve in an exact way that the brain uses approximation. It could be that the biological constraints that we have in the brain just simply don't allow for the computation to be exact.
Yeah. Look, and thank you. And if I can just follow that up, because it seems that we've been kind of talking about this since the 1960s, since the failure of the ideal observer hypothesis of signal detection, which shows that people are sensitive to the sorts of things that the Bayesian brain hypothesis says that they will be sensitive to, but they are indeed suboptimal. And so, yeah, we now have a bunch of collections of demonstrations where people are often suboptimal, they're occasionally optimal. And to me, you can't explain why people are sometimes optimal and sometimes suboptimal within the theory. You need to kind of go outside that and come up with a more general theory of representation and computation on representations. And it sounds to me as though you're already suggesting that you kind of need to go outside the formal Bayesian framework to explain, why people are sensitive to the things that the theory says they should be, but why they're not as optimal as they might be. Is that kind of where you're landing as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I would completely agree. Yeah. And I think probably we need to look into biology and see that the biological constraints just don't render the possibility of being optimal.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Marta. I just had a question about kind of qualitative differences when people are relying on the prior or on the likelihood. Within the task, is it possible that there's this kind of interaction with like the time dynamics, something like fatigue that would affect the prior more than the likelihood?
Oh. I guess it's possible, yes. Just trying to make a prediction. What would I do if I'm more tired? Will I probably revert more to my priors, maybe?
Yeah, and could that interact with the different groups that you're comparing?
With the different groups,
yeah.
Yes. So one thing that is, and it can be an issue, is the spatial memory differences between groups. So with people with schizophrenia, the spatial memory isn't as good, so we would have to control for that as well. I don't actually know with autism. Maybe others in the audience would know better. Yeah, that's a good point. I haven't thought about that yet.
I mean, you could easily find it in the data if you kind of look at the performance over time within the task and see if that's a way of discriminating.
Right, we did look at over the different blocks, how the behavior was changing. And I think the first few trials, it changes quite a bit because people are learning, but afterwards it doesn't change that much. It's pretty stable. Thank you.
All right, we might leave it there since it's about 12. Thanks, Marta, for
thank
speaking.
you.
Thanks, everyone, for watching.
Thank you.